Okay, thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Mhaskar. Um, we are honored and privileged to have you on our podcast today. Here it is September 20th, 2024 in British Columbia, and we have received your consent form. Thank you for that. And you have had a chance to look through the questions, and we are just going to go into the questions after we have an opportunity to just have you introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners. If you can share a little bit about yourself in terms of where you're situated in India and your own positionality statement in terms of as much or as little you would like to share about who you are and the work that you do so that our audience has an idea a little bit about you.
Yeah, thanks, Manu. Thanks for this invitation to join your podcast series. I am Professor Sumeet Mhaskar. I teach at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at OP Jindal Global University, which is located in Sonipat, which is part of the National Capital Region in Delhi. I primarily work on labor issues in terms of the informal economy or large-scale industrial closures, joblessness, and how do jobless workers respond to their precarious conditions, but also overall labor issues in terms of migration, the questions of gender and its role in shaping their occupational choices or religion or caste, and also a little bit interest in labor history. And similarly, connected to my research, I also teach courses on labor history and labor sociology, and labor law and labor sociology, but also courses on research methods such as qualitative research methods or survey research methods, politics of development, and democracy. So this is broadly my teaching and research is concerned. As far as the theme of your podcast is concerned, which is to do with social justice, I also keep a keen eye on social justice issues, primarily around various kind of concerns and exploitation that happens in India particularly, which has to do with either gender or religion or caste, all three together. And I position myself as ex-untouchable or Dalit, and uh, it is one of my own experiences that shapes, but also my own participation in various social movements that has shaped my thinking. But that is one part. But also, I have been trained in the disciplines of political science and sociology, political science in at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and sociology at the University of Oxford. And I have spent a lot of time with historians during my postdoc years in Germany. And that has shaped my way of conducting research or analyzing different complex problems where labor is very much at the center.
Thank you very much. You bring a really rich profile to the work that you do. We're honored to have you on the show today. So with that background, we're going to go right into the questions if you're okay with that. And would you
Sure,
like to be
sure.
called Dr. Mhaskar or would you like to be called Dr. Sumit? Do you have a preference?
I mean, either way, whatever you feel is better.
Okay, all right. Okay, so question number one is how do you understand social justice in your discipline as a senior faculty member?
I think this is, I mean, of course, as you know, somebody who's involved in the project, the question of social justice has several layers. As far as social justice is concerned, one is about students, the other is about own faculty members, and the third is about what do we teach students about the concept of social justice. Now, as far as social justice is concerned, as it is widely known, but just to brief that in India we have social justice programs which ensures a certain amount of proportions being reserved for historically marginalized groups such as the scheduled castes or Dalits and scheduled tribes or the Adivasis. And in the last few decades, also the other backward castes who are socially and educationally backward. That is absolutely distinct from the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, because the other backward castes do not face discrimination. So they do benefit from the social justice program, but they do not face discrimination. And that is a different kind of experience. But nonetheless, so as far as educational institution is concerned, they have certain amount of reserved positions, both at the student level and as well as the faculty level. As far as private universities are concerned, it does not apply to either at the level of students or at the faculty positions. Now, when it comes to curriculum, and this is where I have come to realize that when we talk of social justice, we have to also talk of social injustice and what causes social injustice, and that needs to be taught in the classrooms. To certain extent, I mean, in fact, to a large extent, gender as a form of social injustice and how one can tackle that is very much discussed in the classrooms. And that is part of curriculum. Uh, Religion is absolutely very minimal in terms of social injustice, that what exactly forms of social injustice are prevalent in the country. And as far as caste is comes, it also makes a guest appearance. You have some forms of discussion around caste, and this is something the country as a whole has been uncomfortable about. And as far as school curriculum is concerned, more or less all questions of social justice are absent. Some attempt were made to have some discussions around these questions. But this is something which always causes discomfort to scholars across political ideologies. I must underline this part. And so that remains one of the important concerns. Only at the master's level, maybe, and research level, then you have some amount of these kind of questions or of social justice being hotly debated. But that still remains a contested arena.
All right, thank you. So just to make sure that I caught all that, because you provided multiple examples. So your understanding in the discipline of sociology, which is your area, um, is that social justice is around the concept of access to programs, right? Because you
Mhm,
defined how certain spots have been reserved for historically marginalized groups, including the backward and scheduled tribes and castes. And then you also talked beyond this concept of access, you talked about curriculum, and that curriculum being mostly around the idea of gender inequality, and that religion is not something that is a big big level of concern in India,
mhm,
but more focused on gender and somewhat of caste when it
mhm,
comes to issues of social justice. So, from your sociology background, it's around gender and caste and access to programs. And
mhm.
in terms of when these things show up in the curriculum, it's more likely at the graduate and university level than it is in elementary public schools. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
All right. And so the second part of that first question is, you've been doing this for a number of years now, and you have a senior faculty member status at your
Mhm,
university. I'm wondering if you could speak to your understanding of social justice in sociology from a person who has been studying in that discipline for a very long time and have been at the university for a long time. Because in Canada, as you become a tenured and a senior faculty member, you have more
mhm.
privileges are afforded in terms of freedom of expression around controversial and sensitive topics. And I was
Mhm.
wondering if that is similar in India.
Yeah, as I said, once you teach particularly postgraduate students, of course, there is freedom to design the curriculum, and that remains applicable to both public institutions as well as private institutions. And I teach in a private university, and at both public and private, you have the freedom by and large to design your curriculum and to actually introduce various kind of interesting research papers or books to teach to students. So that level, obviously, we do talk about social injustice and various forms of uh, injustice that takes place in the society, either in economy, politics, or various everyday social relations. So as far as designing that curriculum is concerned, that very much remains. But there has been a shift as well in the higher educational curriculum. So till the 70s or 80s, it was very much within quote the class-dominated discourse, which in a way assumed that gender, religion, or caste would become irrelevant at some point in history. And therefore, that approach pretty much prevented them from actually talking about the various problems that India or South Asia as a society has been undergoing. And that shift we see in curriculum from maybe roughly 90s or something. This is not to say that sociology never talked about caste or tribes or the questions of injustice. But the way right now it has been transformed in terms of what professors teach in the classroom, that has much to do with the social movements. In fact, it is more informed by the social movement and also social media for that matter. And that very much has a big impact on what professors are teaching in the classroom these days, because students themselves are also getting information from wide-ranging sources. Unlike the earlier part where students would sit in the classroom, they would gain knowledge, they would go to the libraries, read books or journals, and they would have access to different kinds of knowledge. But right now you have YouTube, you have various podcasts, and you have social media, so you are really exposed to different kinds of information. So the kind of privilege, one might say, that classroom held prior to the arrival of social media, that is actually come under major challenge, and that needs to be really kept in mind, that as far as teachers are concerned, they could be challenged by some of the extremely smart and brilliant students, and they could question what kind of subjects are being taught and what kind of perspectives are being forwarded by certain kind of professors. And that actually, of course, it's not an easy process because this is something, this is a churning that's happening particularly in the last 10 years. And I believe that this is also challenging for senior professors who are more or less at the edge of retirement, that they were not used to certain kind of pedagogy and these kind of newer kind of challenges that classrooms might throw up before them.
Excellent point. So yeah, the technology has created a different level of access to information across a wide range of interdisciplinary spaces that you might want to talk about social justice issues. So I really appreciate you speaking to the fact that senior faculty sometimes feel challenged by the technological advancements of modern day society, but also the fact that they do have the freedom of expression to talk and devise their own curriculum and bring in their own perspectives. Whether they're political in nature or controversial in nature is not really a problem, which is wonderful to hear. Okay, so if we're okay with question one, we'll move to question two, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, sure.
So question number two is, what, if any, are the social justice issues you have encountered in your area of expertise?
Hmm.
So if you could give
I
us
think
at
one
least
of
three.
the, sorry, yeah.
Yeah,
There was something you wanted to add?
I just want to say if you could at least give us three, that would be wonderful with some examples.
Yeah, I think one of the major social justice concerns is the, of course, issue of caste and its intersections with occupational choices. And I recently finished an essay for an edited volume, which maps the role of caste in modern Indian industry, looking at the cotton textile mills in Bombay over a period of 135 years. And this is something when I was studying in terms of what exactly are the prior scholarship. This is where I find that you don't have data points to connect the 135 years. And there is a sharp distinction between pre 1947 and post 1947. So up to 1947, when the British colonial state was heavily involved in the administration and the gathering of information, you have obviously access to the census data, which included Jati-specific information up to 1931, which also gave you information on what kind of occupations individuals are doing in a very micro setting. But what happens with independence? India as a state abandons the collection of any information on Jati-specific information or even broader caste groups. So now that poses a major problem for scholars like me who are interested in long-term trends. Secondly, and which is a very disturbing uh, fact, is that the scholars, such as sociologists themselves, and of course economists and other scholars too, but sociologists primarily, even they abandoned the collection of data along caste lines. And this is actually an absolutely disturbing pattern because the Indian state, of course, can do certain kind of acts like not gathering information in caste because there are political reasons for that. But as scholars, it was absolutely disturbing that they even adopted the position of the Indian state to stop gathering data, or even when they gather the data, to not analyze that in terms of its impact on any kind of uh, you know setting for that matter, occupational choices. And I have used various kind of sources to map a story about how caste has shaped. And I personally felt as a scholar that instead of picking on one particular movement to talk about whether this works or not, and what exactly has happened to that institution, which actually has been around for a very long time, which also has very codified kind of existence in terms of which groups can do what kind of work, who should they marry to, what kind of wealth you can accumulate, whether you can actually accumulate wealth or not. It is actually not a very promising thing for scholars that we don't have any information for such a long period in between. And this is something I found deeply problematic. And connected to this is the question of social justice then. That if you have lack of information, how can you talk about social justice issues and which is directly connected to the larger public policies? So obviously there was a constitutional mandate which ensured that there is information available on the scheduled castes, that is the Dalits, and the scheduled tribes, the other and the Adivasis. But except these two groups, there is not information. So unless you have information on other groups, a relative kind of exercise could not take place. And that is one of the reasons why now you have demand for including caste in census. I would use this opportunity of your podcast to talk that there is nothing called caste census. There is caste in census. So there is wide-ranging information that the government conducts as far as census is concerned. So you just have to add one extra column of caste. So because somehow there is the political rhetoric around caste census, so people have actually several confusions that there is something separate exercise that needs to be conducted. And the answer is no. You just need to add one extra column to all the kind of information that the government collects. And I think this is one of the major concerns that I have encountered as an expert, that unless you have a solid, robust information, how can you make a case for certain things? And this is something on the second point that has now occurred, is that the Supreme Court has consistently rejected the demands of newer groups who are claiming, some share in social justice through reservations in employment as well as in higher educational institutions. And these are predominantly what sociologists have called as the dominant castes. So they are landed castes. They have socially superior status, and they are also controlling political institutions. And therefore, this kind of information also now has thrown up newer challenges where the Supreme Court is constantly throwing the ball in the court of various state governments that you need to collect data. And I think, if we would have conducted census every year, with one additional information, we probably would not have faced this problem now. And I think this is definitely one of the major concerns that, at least in my area of expertise, that I've faced. And secondly, when it comes to the questions of labor, which scholars are deeply engaged with as historians, as sociologists, or even as economists, much of this has been treated as an abstract category. The labor itself is treated as an abstract category. Again, to certain extent, the gender is very much addressed, and religion and caste remains outside the purview of these kind of analysis. In the last 20 years, though, you have the Indian Human Development Survey data, which has fine-grained kind of data on individuals' caste background and religious background. Of course, there is information on gender as well, and all wide-ranging variables, which has helped scholars to do certain kinds of analysis. In the last, I think last year or something, the state of Bihar in eastern India conducted a census, which included caste as a category, and that provided enough amount of information. So I would very much, keep in center the concerns of gathering information, and something sociology as a discipline has really stopped doing that. So in the last at least 2 to 3 decades, we see that sociologists are not really engaging in large scale statistical exercises of gathering information and testing them. So that is something I feel is a shift that we see, which was otherwise very much a central feature up to the 1960s or even 70s.
So one of the largest concern is the lack of access to large data sets that sort of explain what has happened to the demographics around caste and other intersections with it, so that you can have a better analysis as to what are the needs of the population and what are some of the challenges that the populations face according to their caste categorization, correct? So it seems to be a problem. And then your second part is beyond the demographics, there's also inconsistency in identifying what type of labor categories are out there. It hasn't really been studied in terms of labor and the caste, because if the caste information is missing, then you can't get to the labor component. So it's almost like it's a ripple effect of it. And then the third issue that you've highlighted is that there are improvements coming in this way. So it more seems to be like the next step is looking at the human development data that states like Bihar has started to do. So that's a good thing in the good way. But the two that you really highlight are about the demographics and also about the labor categories in relationship to caste. Okay, so those are your two.
Just one more point, Manu,
Okay,
and which
sure.
again related to gender here.
Yes.
Again, the intersection of caste and gender. So while
Yeah.
there has been massive research on the question of gender inequality, again, the absence of information on caste prohibits any analysis of inequalities within the category of, let's say, the women. That there are
Mhm.
different challenges different women face uh, depending on their social status. And that has been highlighted by, let's say, the field of literature, that you have lots of autobiographies, you have novels being written, but as a larger exercise, I think that is something also still remains missing. Of course, people have highlighted various things, but that remains still a missing part. I mean, throughout, actually, I would say several decades, that within women, that analysis is not still available before us. So on gender inequality, we know, yes, women have broader challenges, but
Mhm.
the specific kind of challenges that is very much part of public discourse do not become part of the academic discussion. I mean, of course, it is there very much in the discussion. But in terms of having a solid number, because sociology also is about large numbers. It's not only about numbers, which unfortunately is a trend that is taking place in certain universities. But this is also an important source of information. And I think that is also missing big time as far as the question of social justice is concerned, that what is now famously termed as intersectionality.
Yeah.
You cannot do an intersectional analysis without having information which is necessary for intersectionality. And I think this is also one of the major concerns I have encountered.
So one clarification piece, because you said that we lack, information on their social class. Are you equating social class with caste?
No, no, I'm not equating social class with caste. I'm just referring to caste and gender, the intersection between these two. But
No,
of
I
course,
get
one
that.
can include then there is no limit in terms of how one can actually go. You can add income, you can add regional, you can add educational. So there is layers. But one of the central social institutions, I mean, there are at least three or four in India. Caste is important, gender, religion, you have regional. And so these are and spatial regional meaning. And so these institutions do shape up individuals' life chances, whether in terms of what kind of work they can do, whether they can have mobility or not, or they are consistently positioned in immobile situation or downward mobility. Do they have chance to go in, let's say, politics in terms of being the people's representative? Can they become the ministers, and what kind of proportion they do have, despite having large constitutional provisions.
Mhm.
In terms of economy, can they be the owners of capital? So these are various challenges, and I think that also needs to be taken into account when we talk of social justice. So social justice is not merely a question about the lower end of economy, about laborers. It is a question which transgresses various classes. And I
Wonderful.
think that that is what these three, four institutions, social institutions, actually do to the Indian society.
Okay. But just for our listeners who are not familiar, from a sociologist's point of perspective, how would you define caste to those who are not familiar with it?
So caste is an institution which has social, political, economic, and cultural dimensions. It is an institution which has graded society in five larger blocks. So you have the priestly caste at the top, then you have the warriors, Kshatriyas, you have the traders in the third block, you have the Shudras or the laboring castes, and at the bottom you have the untouchables. And this is how the society is structured. And the most important part here is that the rights, whether you talk of economic rights, social, political, and cultural rights, they decrease as one follows the caste order in terms of top to bottom. So those at the top have the most rights, share of rights, and the people at the bottom have pretty much no or negligible rights as far as social institution is concerned. And of course, there is more flexibility for people at the top. Like in terms of occupation, the people at the top can choose occupation from the bottom. And this is very much codified in the Manusmriti, the lawgiver for the caste system. And so this is what caste more or less functions. Now, the thing is, this has been the way caste has distributed the rights or absence of rights to various groups. And that has now come in conflict with the modern constitutional norms, which treats everybody as equal and which also provides protection to those whose rights could be potentially violated. And this is a constant conflict that goes on in Indian society, that there are groups who have higher social status and who expect more from the system. And the Indian state is expected to treat everybody equal. And therefore, these kind of conflicts go on. And that is the reason caste needs to be again discussed again and again. Because if this was some institution which was there 2000 years ago and which does not have any influence on what we do today, probably there was no need to discuss this. But the fact that we discuss this is because there is a constant conflict between these two institutions, the modern institution and these very much traditional institutions which continue to influence present day economy in terms of what kind of businesses one can do or who can do that business, who can become the member of parliament from a constituency which is not specifically reserved for certain groups, who can actually have the cultural rights in terms of the temples and the part of temple economy, and also social relations, who can marry whom. Because one of the major problems when it comes to social relations is the marriage of a person from untouchable background, particularly the male member, and a woman from the upper caste background. And that has resulted in caste violence, which results in pretty much the killing of both the youths. And this is a very much a regular phenomena that if you look at what is now, what is reported as within quote honor killing, is caste killings. And this is a regular feature. So this hierarchy of caste from these five groups becomes a reference point for us to understand what exactly is happening in the society. Of course, things change, but the code of hierarchy that actually helps us understand various processes even today.
So this is very interesting. As I listen to you, I'm thinking about how these older institutions, as you describe them, the caste system, is in contrast with the Constitution, which is the legal document for all of India. How is it that the legal authorities have not been able to erode this old historical traditional institution of the caste system? Why is it still being maintained and upheld, if indeed the Constitution is the main legal arm of India?
I think this is a very good question. As far as a liberal democracy is concerned across the world, the expectation from the Indian state, the modern Indian state, is that it will treat everyone in a fair manner, and it will follow the rule of law, which is very much codified in the current, through the current constitution. So you have very much all the modern laws which Western democracies have also in place. But as far as its functioning is concerned, it is heavily dependent on the society, which is very much undemocratic. So just because India adopted a new constitution in 1950 does not mean that individuals who have socially superior status decided, okay, now we are in a new system, now I have to behave in an equal manner to the other citizens. And that behavioral change never took place. And that is the reason the conflict is very much present even today. So obviously the society has to change, and for the society to change, only law is not the instrument. And that's why you see variations across the country. So wherever there have been strong social justice movements, there have been fairer degree of discussion around these questions, and some form of change have taken place. But where there you have lack of social movements, there actually it's really impossible for the state to function in a way, because it's at the end of the day, even those who are sitting on those important positions of, let's say, bureaucracy, or even lawmakers for that matter, or the parliamentarians, they also come with their own prejudices. Of course, we are expecting them to perform in a very liberal and modern way and follow the rule of law, but they have found ways to subvert the provisions of law. And that kind of problem remains, and that is one of the major reasons, to answer your question, that we haven't been able to make that huge leap. Although through the pressures of social movement, the state has been forced to look into matters, but it's always like going one step forward, two step backward. That kind of movement constantly happens.
It's very interesting. Not to go on to this point for too long, but it seems like since 1950, when the new constitution was adapted in India, it's been 70 years. And when we look at, the Americas, and you look at discrimination in some older forms, for example, in the States, there was slavery. and the apartheid and those things, those movements occurred at one point in time. And although there still maintains some level of discrimination, it is against the law to be discriminatory, and those things are punished. And there are very strong sanctions through the legal system that help reinforce the societal behaviors that are accepted and normalized and those that are not. So I guess my question that still remains would be, how come the legal component of the actual accountability of the Constitution does not have the same level of teeth and sanctions on their own Indian citizens when they do step outside of the constitutional norms that have been set out 70 years ago?
Yeah, I think I will have to return to, the inequality within the law enforcement machinery. So you have, of course, adequate, like decent amount of representation for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But also their position within the bureaucracy is very precarious. And the system itself is such that if you, as an officer from the marginalized background, if you decide to implement the rule of law, you may face repercussions in terms of transfer to within code the punishment postings. This is not to say that at a very micro level things may not be working, but at a broader level, the reason we see that changes have taken a little slow space or a very snail space is because the enforcement mechanism is also dominated by people who have prejudice against against such kind of changes. For example, as far as the gender issue is concerned, you still have police stations dominated by the male members, and they bring in their own prejudices in terms of what they consider as gender-based injustice. And therefore, they are the most primary local level state which actually does the recording of the crimes. And if they decide to record the crime under some very superficial kind of section, then in the court of law, the case does not stand. And of course, the courts and the judiciary themselves are highly underrepresented. I mean, it's only in the recent years you have women becoming, part of the Supreme Court judge kind of order. And these are also women from extremely privileged social status. And that tells a lot about judiciary. I mean, judicial kind of, kind of various judgments on various social issues have been extremely conservative. I mean, just like day before yesterday or something, there was a male justice in the Karnataka High Court in South India, who made sexist remark against one of the female counsels standing in front of him. And it is because of the social media kind of furor over those issues. Now the Supreme Court of India has taken a suo motu cognizance in issuing the notice. Now this is because of social media, we actually learn that something has happened. But you have to imagine that there are so many courts where the judges at a very micro level do not really adhere to the rule of law. And therefore, it's more the subversion of law that is rather taking place rather than following the rule of law, because it disturbs the social privileges that is being accorded by the, let's say, the caste system for that matter, which also has the gender component and the religious component.
So this is very interesting that the subversion of the law is more the priority than the preservation of the law within your local police stations and within your local, provincial, or regional, state-based courts. I think this in itself is an opportunity to revolutionize these grassroots movements to better support the local level of dealing with those who subvert the law before you can make changes up at the top. It seems like it needs to come from both sides. If you have a constitution, but you don't have the local level people adhering to the law, then it's not going to work, because those who are supposed to be accountable on a local level are not doing their job. So if you can't do that, then you won't get towards the top. Which brings us actually really nicely into question number 3, which talks about what are some social justice initiatives that are occurring in your discipline to help build awareness and or address social justice issues. So clearly this is a massive issue when people support the subversion of law in the face of all of the issues that you have, clearly stated to us today in terms of caste, demographic information being collected or not. Perhaps that those two are connected together. There seems to be, maybe the reason for not collecting that data has to do with how we are understanding the authority or lack of authority or prevalence of the law in India. What are your thoughts on that? And you can go back to the question too, directly.
No, I think in the discipline itself, I think what I said also applies more or less to the discipline in terms of its practices. Is that, the assumption or the expectation, not assumption, the expectation from the scholarly world is that they would be more sensitive to these questions, and sociologists in particular, or even historians and, economists or other political scientists as well. But sociology, because it directly confronts with the social system, the expectation is that they would be more sensitive. But if you look at higher educational institutions in public, public universities for that matter, you have a very strong resistance from faculty members from socially privileged backgrounds or the upper caste backgrounds to fill up the reservation seats meant for members of scheduled castes or scheduled tribes or even other backward caste as faculty members. So, and it's only in the recent years that, through political pressures that these have been filled up in the last 2, 3 decades. So earlier period was very much marked by a strong resistance even among the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, whom we expect to be far more liberal because they're exposed to different kind of ideas and they are expected to, perform also just a role of social justice. So as academics, I think the only capacity as a professor you have is you be part of the social justice kind of program as far as recruitment of professors is concerned, and that has shown very dismal picture. Even now, there are various higher educational institutions such as the Indian Institute of Technologies, where you have resistance from, I mean, absolutely militant resistance, I would say, from any form of recruitment. You have the Indian Institute of Managements. They have shown absolute apathy towards recruitment. Now, this is at the level of being a colleague. There is a recruitment. And of course, there is, one can go to the layers of what they experience and not. As far as students are concerned, in some cases, there have been biases against students who come from socially marginalized backgrounds. And there have been cases reported about grading them lesser than what they deserve. So this is a problem that very much persists within the discipline. And that I don't think has been addressed enough. Of course, students have used this very interesting instrument of right to information that India had from 2005, that as a citizen, you have right to information from the public institutions. And by using that instrument, students have requested information on the grades they have received for written exam and for the oral exam. And what they have found is that students from socially marginalized groups, particularly Dalits or Adivasis, and to a certain extent the other backward caste as well, that they perform better in written exams, but their marks that they get in the oral exam are absolutely minimal or negligible, which again puts them in a very disadvantaged position in the final selection. So again, this is the faculty members are doing this. So they are very much complicit in actually the acts of social injustices here. And this has been documented on various forums about giving less grades to students from socially marginalized groups. So I think in terms of persistence of the problem, it continues in some form or the other. And as far as addressing those concerns are there, some form of, as I said, data-related concerns are being gradually addressed. through independent state-funded institutions. One of the survey I highlighted is the Indian Human Development Survey data, which is again gathered by one of the state-funded institution. But also scholars are now increasingly gathering the data, but now there is a historical disadvantage for scholars in terms of information, and that needs will take some time in terms of overcoming that situation. But I think in the current form, what we see in the last maybe 7 years or 10 years, in the discipline of sociology or the related disciplines, we do have discussions on caste more. You have discussions on various other kind of social injustices based on the gender, widely speaking, in terms of sexual orientation, the concerns of the transgenders. So you have these discussions being held inside the classrooms. Readings are being circulated to the students. So these issues are coming up. So it's not that entirely they have been resistant. There has been resistance as far as recruitment is concerned of faculty members and how students get treated. But curriculum-wise, I think that is one thing which is being gradually addressed now, that who is to be taught in the class. So you again, so it's so layered in terms of how we talk about. So what is the social background of the author that is included in the reading list also? And that remains still a major challenge. So which is absolute contrast to North America, where these things are openly discussed. And in the context of India, we don't really openly discuss these kind of challenges. And any discussion to these is being dismissed usually as a question of identity, or don't bring identity into scholarly world. That kind of, that let's not play identity politics. And I think this is something that, otherwise India is very good at imitating the North American kind of environment. And this is one thing they don't really want to imitate.
It's very interesting that you say that, because I was going to say here, just like there's resistance for recruitment for other castes in faculties, it's similar here. We in North America, in particular Canada, and now focusing in on BC, there is a really strong desire now to recruit Indigenous peoples. And Indigenous peoples of Canada are seen as one of the most marginalized and vulnerable populations, given the history of what has happened to their people and the cultural genocide that they had experienced through the waves of residential schools here in Canada. And so there are concerns around EDI hires. That's what we call them, equity, diversity, inclusion-based hiring practices. But there are policies that have been constructed that have allowed for those recruitment processes to be followed and are required to be followed and are given preference in job postings at this point within Canada. Secondly, in terms of students feeling like they are not marked fairly, you're in similar ways of right to information. Every student in Canada, whether they're international or they're domestic Canadians, they have access to all information, and all marking is transparent with rubrics and assignments. And there's a complaint process system that goes up to the dean, and each complaint is handled personally and with policies and guidelines for student appeals. There are student appeal committees here within Canada in institutions to support students' work and the integrity that they have within the work that they have submitted to be graded. So it's interesting that India is resisting the identity politics and has not really created a clear path for students who are having difficulties in how they are being assessed. But it is nice to hear that there is some movement in terms of what is considered to be part of the curriculum and content. In BC in particular, we have overhauled the entire provincial curriculum in 2016. And now we have included Indigenous principles and ways and values of life that must be disseminated on the mandatory compulsory age of schooling between kindergarten and grade 12. So it's interesting to hear how curriculum initiatives occur as well within Canada, we it's all policy oriented. Once it's in policy, you follow the policy. Otherwise, there are sanctions against, people who don't follow the policy, and people have the right to complain. And there are channels and procedures that have been laid out to support those who have felt they have been unjustly treated. So I'm not sure how policy work or policy development works in India in respect to moving social justice issues forward and addressing them. But I think it's interesting that, I haven't heard anything around policy from you yet, but very
Yeah.
interesting how India is going about trying to embrace social justice issues to address some of the injustices that are faced in the education system.
Yeah, I think policies to address social injustice have come through political means, and the rest of the society has been, rather against those kind of measures. So, unlike what you say in what is happening in Canada, if people are not following those kind of policy measures, they could be held accountable, and that is not happening here. That those who, let's say, don't implement certain kind of policy at a micro level, so at a departmental level, if the faculty members decide that they want to reject all the candidates by just saying not found suitable, to not implement that affirmative action program, none of these faculty members are held accountable. That there is no inquiry that takes place that, look, there were good candidates and yet the whole panel decided that none of them are found suitable. And this is one of the major excuses that has been used for several decades to actually subvert the affirmative action policy. And therefore, the affirmative action in employment has only taken place at the level 3 and 4 of employment. It has never taken place at the professional level. I mean, it has taken at a very micro level, I would say. And so, therefore, there is no cost to actually disobey the law. Yeah.
That's
So
very
there is no
interesting.
accountability here. Even for judges, I mean, those who are supposed to be fair, there is no cost even for them.
Okay.
And unless it becomes a very politically sensitive issue, it still doesn't actually provide justice. So, for example, there are large-scale violences that have taken place,
That's
and you have state-instituted commissions, but it more or less becomes a form of torture for those victims rather than a means to obtain justice. So
right.
the mechanism is such that you can complain what you just said in your case, that
Yes.
you can complain obviously even when, let's say, a faculty or student faces discrimination,
Hmm.
but the student has to pay more price through going through mental trauma here. So
Hmm.
there is no support system as far as providing support to the students. And therefore, and it is precisely the reason the norms which have guided for like so many years or centuries continue to be reproduced in different forms. That there is no accountability here. That if the college principal decides not to implement affirmative action or subvert it, they are not going to face any form of action, or
Hmm.
it is delayed in such a manner that even when the crimes have clear evidence, the court cases goes drags for 20 years, 30 years,
Wow.
and which makes it in a way meaningless. I mean, it puts the burden on the victim to follow up the case.
Right.
And it is precisely for that reason, I think, even within the discipline, as I said, the faculty members have been actually pretty much militantly against affirmative action.
Hmm.
And their own prejudices have prevailed over the rule of law.
Yeah.
So they are not saying that, okay, now, this is what the government of India says, this is the law, we need to have these, as you said, indigenous group needs to be given preference in these two positions. Now let's find the person and we are done with the job. In fact, they have gone contrary, that they have used all possible mechanisms to ensure that this policy is not implemented. And the lack of accountability, or to make them part of the responsibility, is something that the policy kind of implementation remains still a major hurdle.
Okay. So it sounds like policy is mere rhetoric, and it sounds like people have unchecked power, and they use a lot of
Uh,
excuses and procedural ways to drown out any sort of implementation or accountability. So that's very interesting that you can, so clearly articulate that because that's what I'm getting here.
no, also, I mean, I'm not saying that none of the policies have been implemented, but they
No,
have
but there's
always been, yeah, but there has been strong resistance. Like I'll give one example. When I was a student of Jawaharlal Nehru University,
mm-hmm,
so one of the students, he finished his master MPhil degree, and he was he got through this position in one of the state universities as
mm-hmm,
the assistant professor, and he got the letter. He went to join, and the day of joining the letter of his joining that particular department, he was told, oh no, there is some confusion and you cannot join.
mm,
And so this is one of the major problem. But then Professor Sukhdev Thorat, who is well known for talking about social justice, he became the chairman of the University Grants Commission. And since he was also living then in the University campus, uh, we approached Professor Thorat saying that, look, this is a student who is now facing injustice. He has received the official letter of joining, but the vice chancellor in that university is not allowing him to join. And
mm-hmm,
obviously, being at the helm of power, he immediately, did several phone calls. And the following working day, the person could join the university. But this is just one example I'm giving that if this person did not have access to person who is actually there at the helm of that particular department and who
right,
was also positively taking the case, probably he would have not had the opportunity to work there.
right,
So even when the procedurally first you reject the candidate by saying they're not found suitable, and when for somehow you actually have a situation when you find suitable candidates, you all even offer them job letter,
I
you
see.
decide them to harass by saying that no, you can't join because there is some technical error.
Yeah,
So this is just one example I'm giving because it involves somebody like Professor Thorat, was the chairperson of the University Grants Commission, which pretty much has a say in the 300 plus universities that are across the country.
right,
And it's only through his intervention this thing was resolved. Now you can imagine what may have happened in some small regional colleges where
right.
these subversions takes place.
Okay. Well, again, a very good lead into question number 4, but more focused personally on you. How do you respond to microaggressions or forms of discrimination, if any, that you have experienced? So just like in that example that you shared that that student faced, or that faculty, that potential
Mhm.
faculty faced a form of discrimination in the last minute rescinding offer of the employment. I wonder if you can comment on your own self if you've ever, experienced a microaggression and how did you respond to it? How did you deal with it?
I mean, there will be a long list, honestly, but we don't have time for that. And one of the microaggressions, I would say, is choosing the topic of your own interest. And interestingly, how social institutions also play in who can study what kind of topics. So labor as a topic is, which is what I, realized in the last 15 years that I'm studying this thing, is that labor as a topic in abstract sense also is pretty much a topic which is kept for the socially privileged or the upper caste groups. And anybody else studying just labor is not acceptable. And that resistance I have seen in the last 15 years that you can study caste, you can study Dalit and labor, but just labor, you cannot study. Just labor movement, you cannot study. This is not to say nobody's stopping you, but the kind of platforms, the conferences you go, the invitations, so that you can see resistance. And of course, these are all well meaning people in public life. I must underline that part. But there is a massive resistance to people in terms of studying what kind of topic. So you are also ghettoized. So as a woman, you are only supposed to study gender, right? You cannot study something else. You cannot study the nation or whatever. And it's similarly here. that if you belong to an untouchable group or Dalit group, then okay, everybody is happy as long as you study only that part. But if you want to talk about generally about labor movement, then there is a strong militant resistance, I must say. It's not a very small microaggression. It's a very hardcore aggression. And since it happens on a very regular basis, it can actually dissuade people from choosing freely what they want to study as a scholar. But I have had the advantage of studying in Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is one of the premier institutions in India. Then I have, of course, had the privilege of studying at the University of Oxford, which is globally one of the best institutions in the world. And of course, I have been to Stanford and all kinds of institutions. So for me, this is, I pretty much don't really care, honestly speaking, what people think. And I continue to write what I like. But yes, even with my kind of academic credentials, if people are not happy, you can imagine what happens to people who do not have access to the best or the prestigious institutions in the country or the world. So that remains a problem in terms of how scholars perceive you. Uh, they can also decide not to cite you, which is what is openly talked about in the North America. There is a politics around citations and how various kind of social identities play a role. But thanks to internet, I would say, and social media, that there has been a minor change here. But these are very much what I would term them as the feudal custodians of academia, uh, who haven't changed their ways of behavior towards fellow scholars, and they also bring in their own prejudices at maybe organizing a conference, what kind of invitations you get, what kind of topics they expect you to speak. They tell a lot about their own prejudices. So who will talk about, I don't know, let's say the industrial strike in Bombay, and I have written a preface to a book which was reprinted in like 3 4 years ago. So I was not expected to write that. But this is a white scholar from Netherlands who approached me, and I happily agreed to his invitation to write a preface to his new edition. But that is something people don't expect. But these things will happen all the time, honestly speaking. And one has to unfortunately overlook because it can create lots of kind of problems for yourselves also in terms of your everyday living. So that is not going to go away. That, let me put this on record. That is not going to go away, no matter how great exposure you have to all kinds of problems in the world. So you might be militantly taking a position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but you are extremely conservative when it comes to your own society. And that is very much reflected in India. And this also applies to South Asians abroad as well, that they could take very well like strong positions either in favor of Palestine or Israel based on whatever they feel, but they are extremely conservative when it comes to talking about the institution of caste for that matter, or the or the issue of the indigenous people. So that contradiction is very much visible now.
That is so interesting that you say that. We've done a podcast series with just South Asian Canadians scholars who are here in Canada. And I had
Mhm.
the honor and privilege of interviewing 8 different South Asians. And it was very interesting to me to hear when it came to their own identity, how many spoke about it and how many did not even mention it. Or when they did speak about issues around caste, it was always outside of them. It
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily directly connected to them. So it is what you're saying, that point is has a resounding effect at this point. So I appreciate you declaring it and stating it so openly. But it is interesting where people feel comfortable to make their views and values known and where they are not going to speak about it. And I wonder if that goes back to those behaviors that are internalized from very young age, from wherever they're growing, in whichever household they are, or from whichever cultural society upbringing that they've had, despite the fact they have been exposed to multiple ways of thinking and open-minded conversations on probably all those various fronts of identity politics and social justice issues. It is interesting. It seems to be consistent.
Yeah. I think it's of course, I mean, upbringing is one part, but then as a young person, you are exposed to the world, and if you're privileged, you are exposed to even more information. But I think as it happens with patriarchy across the world, that it's not easy to give up privileges. That one thing is to talk about injustice, and the other thing is to actually give up privileges. And I think nobody wants to give up privileges. And that is one of the reasons that you always want to see something outside and not inside. That the moment you say inside, then your own podcast, the people you invited would have to share some very uncomfortable information about how they probably were silent on certain issues when things were happening. Because this is an everyday discussion. Because see, people, and this is also, I mean, I also see when people, students are talking that it's public discourse. They don't want to talk about caste for that matter. But caste is everywhere. You display your caste and micro caste information in matrimonial advertisements. Your parents discuss caste, I mean, across the world, actually, South Asian. And your marital choices, especially for women and also for men. And these are discussed very openly. So it's not that they are not exposed to this particular behavior. It's just that because this has become part of something to be shamed of and not as a badge of honor, it's a little difficult situation for them. That at the same time, you want to continue your traditions because it offers you wide-ranging privileges, but you also want to be modern and you want to see yourself as the great liberal modern person that probably you're not. But then these contradictions, I mean, of course, I mean, as individual, as humans, we will all have all kinds of contradictions. But we are talking of people who are exposed to different kinds of situation and they take strong positions on them. As a student of Jawaharlal Nehru University, I mean, which is one of the most important place for all kind of heated discussions around the world, around the war in Israel, not the war in Israel, the war in Iraq. As a student, we have participated against the war in Iraq. And that same enthusiasm was not seen by these students on any social justice issues around caste in India at all. And that contradictory behavior was very much part of the Jawaharlal Nehru University Students' Union, which is the most radical students' union in the country. And the most vocal also gets the most media attention around the world. And they have a long history of remaining silent on caste crimes, absolute silent. So they have very much been vocal on World War II, maybe. They have been vocal on, I don't know, Nazis and all kinds of crime, and but on caste, very much absolute silence.
It makes me, I had to interrupt there and really ask the question. I wonder if students feel unsafe in speaking about caste and the discrimination within caste and talking about this very highly sensitive topic because of what you have talked about in terms of legal accountability, lack of policy, sanctions when people don't address. If policy is not supported, and if the legal framework of India and its constitution, boiling down to the local police station, is not one that upholds the law, but learns to subvert it, I think that's why there's a lot of silence. I don't think that the students have any difficulty talking or thinking about these issues. I'm sure there's conversations, they're just not publicized. And I wonder, I wonder if it's actually a level of structural oppression that occurs on that level of system. When the
Mhm.
system is one that shuts down conversation, given the lack of sanctions and the lack of support, then it's not safe to talk about it.
No, I
You
don't think
have a
it's a
thought?
safety is, no, I won't say safety is at all any concern.
Okay.
Uh, I mean, I have closely observed the student politics, which pretty much reflects the national politics in a way.
Okay.
And so I don't think there is people will have to be afraid of talking about it.
Mm.
It's just that they decide, I mean, these are obviously left inclined students who are inclined towards socialism or communism as a political ideology. And interestingly, maybe in other parts of the world, they have taken up the questions of indigenous groups and racism. My own experience of staying in Germany, I have seen that the left student groups are more sensitive towards racism there, and they have really been at the forefront of confronting the police in those kind of situations. That has
Right.
not happened in the case of India. Those students who are associated with left groups across various variations, as it happens in the left, you have more revolutionary, super revolutionary, or hyper revolutionary groups. One
Yes.
thing that remains common across them is they have been silent on cause.
But the question is
And
why, Dr. Sumeet? Why are they silent? What is holding them back in terms of having these conversations? Why are the local community folk, whether they're in higher education or whether they are, in the labor market or whether whatever occupation that they have, no matter what demographic they are, why is there silence around this particular social injustice?
I think one of the things I said is to do with privileges, and privileges which also has direct material dimension in
Right.
terms of distribution of resources. Because
But
at the end of the day, the share of resources will be limited.
that's
And
understandable, but that's a very limited perception of social justice as a redistribution of,
yeah, so
wealth
I
and
would say,
materials. But why wouldn't those who are oppressed or who are at the very bottom of this hierarchy, within the caste system, the untouchables, why wouldn't they have a, ability to have a civil rights movement in this? Just
oh,
like
no,
they
no,
did
no.
with, in the US. The Black civil rights movement
Yeah, yeah.
was for those who were most marginalized and most vulnerable, but they stood and they spoke amongst the silence, which was trying to suffocate and maintain inequities on a structural manner.
No, no, I think then I need to clarify that it's
Right.
not those who are facing injustice, they have not able to do any movement. In fact, there is a long history of people who have been oppressed by the caste system.
Right.
They have organized more than 150 years. Like, of course, there has been strong organization from 1920s onwards. And they have been able to put forth their demand before the British colonial state,
Right.
as well as before the Indian state. And one of the reasons, at least in the Western India, several of these affirmative action policies were implemented was due to the efforts of the Dalit Panthers movement, which was directly, I mean, one of the influence comes from Black Panthers in terms of some
Yes.
modes of functioning. But there has been always this little thing that just because there is Black Panther, something emerged here. The answer is no. There has been some militant kind of anti-caste politics that is very much they're part of the Indian system. But it was just that particular moment across the world in late 1960s and early 70s where people were borrowing a certain kind of languages from each other. And you have Dalit Panthers, which had a long-lasting legacy on the implementation of affirmative action policies. And therefore, wherever you have anti-caste movement, which is respectfully influential in terms of holding the state accountable, some form of implementation has happened. Even when it comes to the crimes, if justice has happened, it's only because these anti-caste groups have really been politically motivated and mobilized to pressurize the government of the day to take care of those particular issues. Uh, I was more referring to the non-oppressed groups
Okay.
who, irrespective of having a strong political ideology of social justice, such as socialism or communism, have remained rather silent on these kind of issues.
Yeah, no, I understand. I guess I guess my question is with these different affirmative action policies, I guess the spaces of higher education within India have not mobilized in a way where students who are from marginalized caste backgrounds are there in insignificant numbers in order to make their voices and opinions heard, along with faculty that represent those same castes
Mhm.
being represented in these universities. So it becomes more of who is attending the higher institutions and who
Yeah.
is privileged enough to speak in those higher institutions. So it goes back to that idea of having those discourses being brought up, I guess, by the people who are most impacted by them. Obviously, those who are privileged want to maintain their privilege and are not
Mhm.
speaking out. And I think I understand that point you've made, but I wonder why there have not been more spaces created for those who are from the
Mhm.
untouchables class, and
I
why are they
think,
not within the university system?
yeah, I think part of the answer goes back to like the implementation of these policies for accessing higher education. Initial years in the post-independence era, the proportion was very less. It's
Hmm.
only in like late 80s or even in 90s that you begin to have a big chunk of students from the socially marginalized group who entered higher educational institutions.
Right.
So you have a small proportion entering in 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and they at college level, at a at a small college level, of course, these have been the spaces which have thrown up very interesting leadership,
Mm.
and question of social justice was there. But if you look at the premier institutions across the country,
Right.
it's only in the 80s or 90s that you have a big number, and particularly after 2006, there is a major change in social composition of the student. And that change has also brought about changes in the questions that are discussed on the campuses now.
Of
So the
course.
kind of campuses like discussion we see now goes to the 2006 kind of changes, which introduced policies for the other backward caste groups, which are socially and educationally backward. So that makes it to 50%. And of course, there is preference for women. So you have more than 50% of women in campuses. And so that demography has changed. And that is one of the reasons that the kind of issues that are now discussed in campuses are very different from what they discussed in 1970s and 80s and even early 90s. So the shift in demography of students has also brought about shift in the discourse on campus.
So that's exactly why I'm wondering how come there hasn't been more movement in it. That's about 40 years now, right?
Yeah, pretty
So
much,
in
yeah.
40 years, we haven't had any in India, any big social movements from students in these premier institutions that their demographics have changed. Why has there not been substantial change by now?
No, you can see a big kind of change from 2008-9 onwards. And therefore, when Rohit Vemula was compelled to commit suicide in Hyderabad in 2012, I think 11 or 12, that it actually sparked a national movement across campuses. So he was from the untouchable background,
Mhm.
and he was for his own political kind of activism. He was harassed by the institutions, which eventually showed that very high-profile kind of government intervention was, done to keep him silent, and he protested in a very huge manner, and that is one of the reasons that his suicide, which was compelled by these various political factors, actually sparked off a massive student agitation across the country. And so that is very much there, and there are student groups who are doing. But
Great.
it's yeah, so it is not that it's totally absent. Of course, it's happening, but at the same time, you have a new campus now in the last 15 years, particularly.
Okay.
And that is the reason you should see the change now. So you need to have the demography also on campus to talk about. You cannot have a very patronizing kind of approach where you only have the privileged groups talking about there is bad things happening in the world. So you
Right.
need that kind of, so that the radicalism can come only through when people also are there in those positions to talk about those
Right.
problems.
Right. Okay, great. So let's move on to question 5. Where do you turn to for inspiration and support when dealing with structural/policy inequities that you face in your field?
So there is, I mean, of course, there are intellectual kind of sources where one turns to inspiration, and there are, of course, people who have actually played an important role in both scholarly as well as policy. And I mean, without doubt, I think the anti-caste movement is a source of inspiration, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar is the central inspiration, who actually has all the extremely, the best credentials in the world for his time, probably the only person who had the best credentials intellectually. And also his own intervention in the policy dimension is absolutely path breaking, which you don't have in even in the United States for that matter. That this, because of his intervention, it was constitutionally mandated that these groups should be protected and various kinds of provisions should be made to address the social injustices. So there are also several people in line with him who have taken these approach and they continue to take inspiration, whether in terms of writing good texts or in terms of actually dealing with policy questions. And of course, his approach was also in terms of addressing policy questions, very deeply empirical question. His own writings relied heavily on large-scale statistical data, uh, on wide-ranging texts, on informations, to create and build an argument. And I think that remains one of the important source as far as thinking about the society, thinking about the change in the society, and also the methods that can be deployed to bring about the change. That, of course, law is one step in the direction of change. But in addition to law, you also need social awareness. You need to work on various fronts. You cannot say that once the law is put in place, people will automatically start behaving in a nice manner. And that doesn't happen. People are there to break the law. And therefore, in addition to that, you need social awareness, social movements, and you also need a consistent engagement with the newer challenges. This is what I would say.
Okay, wonderful. So I think you've actually started answering a little bit of question 6, which is
Mhm.
what are some possibilities and recommendations that you have to help promote social justice education in your discipline? So I think it would be in the same line of saying that you need to create social awareness, and you would also need to have the law and policy sort of support what you are trying to accomplish in trying to create a more socially just society, and work that you can have access to in terms of data. In order for that to even occur, you need to also have this social awareness of why it's so important to have the full data set and all
Yeah.
of the details around demographics so that you can actually have accurate information to base your analysis and findings on in any good research. Am I
No, I
right? Is
think,
that kind of
yeah, I
where
think,
you're
yeah, you
going?
are definitely, yeah, no, 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 you are right. More or less, we are moving in that direction.
Okay.
Just to like, but also what we need, and something that I learned while living in Germany for 5 years doing postdoctoral research, is that they have taken the Holocaust very seriously,
Yes.
and which is very much part of their curriculum at a very micro school level curriculum, that they teach students across various groups that this is something that is unacceptable. What happened is unacceptable. This is something we cannot actually tolerate, anti-Semitism and the kind of massive crimes that took place because of that. And I think as a policy recommendation, I would definitely say that different kinds of inequalities, whether caste or gender or even religion for that matter, religion is an also important institution that causes major kind of vulnerabilities for minority groups, religious minority groups such as Muslims. And this needs to be also taught in the school curriculum. And I think this is extremely important so that children at a very young age understand what kind of problems are there in the society, but in a very gradual manner. It's not that suddenly they are exposed to these problems only in social science and humanities discipline at a master or like a bachelor's or master's level. And that remains still a major gap as far as creating awareness is concerned. And awareness would also build up social consensus on policy recommendations. So the subversion that constantly happens would in a way stop if you start building that consensus at a very school level, that you openly talk about these issues, that yes, this is a problem, but there is no problem in talking about these issues. Right now we are making it a big problem in talking about those issues, and therefore school curriculum is not reflective of that. Second thing, not just my discipline but in overall, because India is moving more towards privatization of higher education, there is a strong requirement of the state to intervene in providing scholarships to students from these groups who also happen to have a very low level of economic attainment. The access to income is very lower, and therefore their chances of having social and economic mobility and educational mobility will be restricted further. So, as somebody who is also based in public policy school, I think this is one of the important things. The last part, which of course there could be wide ranging, but the last part is also about being owners of capital. And this is something that has been overlooked, that just because we had affirmative action in employment, that we need to create possibilities for owners of capital, that the state itself is the biggest source of creating owners of capital. And the state can create that, because one thing that constantly people forget, that even in 1950s, of the total jobs, not more than 5% jobs were in the public sector, which is where the affirmative action was implemented. So we are talking of only 5 jobs historically, and that has now come down to 3. So India's economy in 1950s was roughly 92%, which means you have no affirmative action in 92 jobs. Then there is private formal sector, you have no affirmative action there. Then you have only left with the government sector. And right now the government sector is only 3.5%, of which at the class 3 and 4 level, half of them are contractualized. So we are talking only of, I don't know, 1% of jobs where affirmative action is implemented. And because there is a massive confusion among students, I also teach a lot of students, that somehow there is this assumption that the formal public sector is huge, that of the 100 jobs, maybe 50 jobs are in the private, in the public sector. That has never been the case. It has only been very tiny, extremely tiny. And I think one of the ways, because you can only do social justice at a very micro level, I think now the discussion is emerging that you need to also talk about the owners of capital and how the state of India can actually support them by providing them assured businesses so that they eventually emerge as owners of capital, because there is a massive historical disadvantage because of which they are not able to emerge as owners of capital on their own. So I think this is very few kind of recommendations for the lack of time, I would, say.
No, those are excellent recommendations, and it gives us a lot to think about. I can understand the recommendations in terms of curriculum implementation through the young ages all the way through, so that there's consistency, the importance of creating awareness and consensus and moving towards having scholarships for funding, especially for those who are not able to access funds for education. And then this whole concept of owners of capital, I think that definitely is something that's newer that has been brought up by you in our podcast series. And I think thinking about owning capital is, in the North American context, capital is seen in multiple ways. So you could have social capital, you could have economic capital, cultural capital. There's lots of different capitals. But I think given your contextualization of the current state of India being mostly privatized, and you so aptly put it that only 1% is now looking at more public, the public sector. If most of it is privatized, then there is something to be said about obtaining capital and having access to even obtain capital. But I wonder if we keep going in that direction and we hyper privatize everything, I wonder what the implications of that are on education and the greater society, in contrast to
Just a
what it would be
minor,
like if we flipped it, right?
no, I think just a minor, clarification once again
Sure.
here, that it was always private.
Yeah.
The economy was heavily private, even
Mm-hmm.
at the time of independence. It was 95% in the hand of private.
Okay.
And yeah, it's merely 5% that the state had a stake, 5 to 7%, like some margin here and there.
Mhm.
So historically speaking, the share of public economy was also tiny comparatively, and that has shrunken down. So in
Yeah.
a way, we are not promoting any private kind of economy. It has
Right.
been private. It's just that what could have been addressed in 1950s, that since such a large share of economy is privately controlled, we need to also do affirmative action in this direction, that we create owners of financial capital from these historically marginalized groups. And that has not happened. And I think now is a time when, anyway, it is more or less an accepted fact that historically it has been the case. Even now, it has gone even further. So maybe this could be one of the major policy interventions that needs to be done.
I understand. And I think that it's good that you made that clarification, but I also think that if the privatization of the labor market has been since almost time, for many centuries, it's been this way. If that's the case, and it's been working in the favor of those who are in more privileged spaces, I think I think it's even more harder to make a case against and introducing policy that sort of brings affirmative action into it. So if it was already in the 90 percentile and now we've gone even further more, I'm not sure. I mean, I would love to believe in the hope and enthusiasm in your voice to say that policy intervention would make things better in terms of affirmative action in the private sector. But if that has been the way it's been and it has been upheld and maintained that way, what makes you feel that in the current state of 2024, when it's increased by 3% more, that we might have a chance of changing it?
No, I think it's of course, very practical question, and that's
Mhm.
why I made a very specific recommendation on owners of capital and not job reservation in private sector. Because if subversions can happen in public sector, it can easily happen in private sector. So therefore, I am less hopeful about the employment kind of affirmative action in private sector. Uh, the more easier form is the promoting the owners of capital. And that is not impossible task, which is some states have done the experiments, and a tiny degree of success has happened. And so this is something doable because it's the government. So if a government is the agency, there is a hope. If you rely on market, there is absolutely no hope. So therefore, my policy recommendation of owners of financial capital comes from the intervention by the state, by the government, where it is still possible through political pressure and stuff like that. But if we rely on market as a mechanism for correcting social injustice, that I don't think that is going to happen.
Okay, on that very hopeful note, I think we will close. Thank you for your insights today. We really appreciate you taking out the time. Sorry, we've taken a lot of your time today, but it was an honor and a privilege listening to you and learning from you today. And I do hope we have the opportunity to meet again and do this good work. So thanks
Yeah.
once again.
Thanks, Manu. Thanks for this invitation. And I also enjoyed talking with you about these various questions. And I hope that our discussion also provides leads for different kinds of research or hopefully certain kind of policy intervention in future.